Mr. Rogers currently serves as the Director of Gift Planning and formerly directed the Hamilton Fund. He is an author and speaker. He has written historical pieces for Hamilton Magazine, in addition to leading regular tours of the cemetery. He is descended from 3 generations of Hamiltonians going back to the mid-19th century, and is the parent of a Hamilton alumni in the class of 2021. He holds degrees from Harvard College, Middlebury College, and the General Theological Seminary. We are so happy and proud to have him here today to speak to this relatively small but extremely interested audience. Welcome, Mr. Rogers.
All right, that better? So my second question is, how many of you have actually been to the Hamilton College Cemetery? Oh, okay, boy, I'm among friends. I'm among friends. Well, thank you. Welcome, as I like to say up on the hill, welcome to the Last Dormitory, as we call it, so named by Alexander Woolcott, our great alumnus, about whom more in a few moments. I'm the self-appointed dean and docent of the cemetery, and I will tell you that my interest really descends from the fact that I do have several generations of Hamilton alumni in my family. And when I came to Hamilton in 2012, I began to sort of imagine my forebears walking about College Hill using buildings that are still there, the chapel notably. In fact, to be clear, the years are 1847, class years 1847, 1852, 1900, and 1936. So a range of eras at Hamilton College. So that sparked my interest. And I will tell you, frankly, I am not a graveyard maven. I'm not a graveyard maven per se. I'm interested in them. I take a look at them when I see them. But really what motivated me about Hamilton is, and Hamilton Cemetery, is the fact that you can tell the story of Hamilton College largely through the gravestones in our cemetery and contemplating the lives that they represent. So that's sort of how I got involved in all of this. I don't consider myself a prophet, but I like to think that, like Ezekiel, when I take people through the cemetery, by the way, I have hosted well over 1,000 guests since I have started doing the tour. I think of it as a way of making the dry bones live. I hope that that's how people feel after they get done. Like Ezekiel in the Bible, I make the dry bones live. Part about it, I don't mean to get too mystical about this, but I've encountered various writers. Sometimes I make it kind of a literary tour as well as a historical one, and I've found some interesting writers who've reflected on death and dying and graveyards. I thought T.S. Eliot was quite striking, speaking of beyond the language of the living. There's something that can speak to us in cemeteries that is important for us to hear. I will also say I am influenced by this gentleman, a scholar at University of California, Berkeley, Thomas Lacker, who's written a perfectly enormous book called The Work of the Dead, where he surveys human treatment of the dead going back to the earliest of times. And his point is that we place a burden on the people that we put in cemeteries. They do work for us. It's the work of memory. And that's why I think of our cemetery as I call it, in addition to the Last Dormitory, a community of memory. So all tying back to the history of the college and the kinds of things that we can derive from the cemetery. So it's appropriate that I'm here, I guess, today, because I discovered just last week with Dawn that my friend, Frank Lorenz, was president of this august institution, and it was from Frank that I inherited the cemetery tour. It goes back a little further than that, as we'll see. There's the stone of David Ellis. David Maldwin Ellis, a Hamilton College class of 1938, who was a professor of history, American history, for many years at Hamilton. He was a specialist in New York State history. I feel sure he was a member here. He wasn't an officer, but I feel sure he was a member here. And he did a lot of historical work on the cemetery that Frank then inherited. He named his cemetery tour after a talk that David Ellis had given. And so we have a chain, the great chain of being, David Ellis to Frank Lorenz, and now to yours truly. And there's David. I like to read this because this, if I had to describe our cemetery in one sentence, it would be this. One could cite many distinctions: integration of races, sexes, nationalities, and even academic disciplines. Southern exposure and no seepage. I don't really like to think about that. Total security and no incidents of grave robbing, although we'll talk about one in a moment. An ionic freeze, and a place in literature. What more has California's forest lawn cemetery to offer except Wurlitzer, Oregon? If you know anything about forest lawn out in California, they have in their, I guess in their chapel or whatever, in Wurlitzer, Oregon. We don't have that, but we have a lot of other things. So we have a very, highlight of our calendar year at Hamilton is the giving of the Class and Charter Day address. And in 1984, it was David Ellis's turn, and he presented his tongue-in-cheek, in some respects, views on the Hamilton College Cemetery, entitled "The Biblical Illusion, Giants in the Earth." And that was the title Frank Lorenz used for many years. I used it a few times, and then seeing a marketing opportunity, I thought Last Dormitory might work a little bit better. And sure enough, attendance has spiked since I started calling it the Last Dormitory. People can't seem to resist. One thing I will say, if you note in this picture, the gentleman to the left of Frank in the red shirt, the gentleman to the left there, there's a much younger version of Fred Rogers, by the way. That is Ralph Oman, class of 1962, a distinguished Washington attorney, patent attorney actually, and also his class analyst. We'll talk a little bit later about the tradition of the class analyst letter at Hamilton at reunion weekend. Anyway, from under the podium, as he gave his class analyst letter, he pulled out the footstone from Anna Juliet Higgins' root, no less a figure than one of the roots that had been purloined, as I like to say, from the cemetery in the fall of 1958 by a member of the class of 1962, and it remained in that person who has not been named in his possession for 54 years, and was mailed to Ralph on the occasion of the class's 50th reunion, and Ralph, with great flourish, produced it from under the podium, and it now, as you can see, is back in the cemetery, where it belongs. Of course, in the 19th century, it was fairly common to have a headstone and a footstone, the footstone being much smaller, marking the position of the coffin in the ground, and so you see her initials, AJHR. So that would be the only instance that I know of grave robbing. There's a lot, obviously Hamilton is a traditional place, and I think about tradition when I work in the cemetery, and Elihu Root, our esteemed alumnus, Elihu Root, gave a centennial address in 1912, where he spoke of the indefinable and mysterious quality which has been transmitted from a remote past. And here we circle back to my historical interest in the cemetery, and I sense that. It's the language of the dead that we hear, if we have an ear to hear it when we're in the cemetery, really right back, as Elihu Root says, to the moment of his birth. Let's talk a little bit about Elihu Root. I think you probably certainly know that the Roots are arguably a founding, if not the founding family, because Samuel Kirkland actually founded the institution, they're certainly the first family of Hamilton College. Elihu Root was not the first. His father was Orrin Root, class of 1933 at Hamilton, who came off the family farm down the road in Vernon, and became a professor of mathematics at Hamilton. It was a common practice in the 19th century that continued well into the 20th century that students would give often scurrilous nicknames to their professors. And a math professor named Root would inevitably be named Q Root, as old Orrin was known. His son, Orrin Root Jr., class of 1856, was also a mathematics professor at Hamilton and was dubbed Square Root. And it was it was Orrin Root Jr.'s brother, Elihu Root, who was class of 1864 at Hamilton College. I like to say that the career of Elihu Root unfurled like a drum roll. After a year, when he graduated from Hamilton, he spent a year teaching at Rome Free Academy. But he was a man of ambition and set his cap for New York City, where he went to earn his law degree at New York University Law School, and then began a career in corporate or commercial law, defending the likes of Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall, and also industrial potentates, captains of industry like John Hay Whitney, for example. So when I came to Hamilton, I sort of scratched my head. I looked around, and there's Root Hall, and there were all the Root houses up on College Hill, and I thought, well, where did that money come from? Well, it didn't come from Orrin Jr. teaching at Hamilton College, I can assure you. It came from Elihu Root's very successful commercial law practice before he then, and to his great credit, devoted the rest of his life to public service. And what public service there was. He served first as the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, which, if you know about the legal profession, the legal world is to this day remains an important government legal position in our system. Even though it's based out of New York City, it has national influence. He then served as Secretary of War for President William McKinley, and it was during that time, the Spanish-American War, that Elihu got his hands on a couple of old decommissioned cannons, which he sent back to his old college. And if you've been up on College Hill recently in front of Sweet Hall, our admission office, there are two scary-looking cannons that are trained to the I guess it would be to the south. And those came from Elihu Root's days as Secretary of War. He also reformed the curriculum at, kind of dabbled in educational design, I guess, at the War College, the Army War College. Probably his most important role was as Secretary of State for President Theodore Roosevelt. After that, he founded the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He was the first president of that institution, which continues today, of course, and also served as a United States Senator from the state of New York. All the while he was in Washington doing those important functions, he was a trustee of Hamilton College. Most of that time, I like to say that he was born a trustee of Hamilton College, and he spent most of his adult life he was chairman of the Board of Trustees. Always kept a close eye on Hamilton. Summered here on College Hill. It was said that you didn't touch a leaf on the campus without consulting Elihu Root, and we'll see an example of that in a minute. I can't resist reading for you the description of Elihu Root's burial on College Hill. Our cemetery is a small and humble little place, but it has great dignity. And his biographer wrote, on February 9th, 1937, the cold rain drizzled across the campus as the simple funeral service was conducted in the college chapel. The college choir sang, and the undergraduate members from his own fraternity were the only pallbearers. They carried him along familiar campus aisles under the vaulted nave of gray, high-arching elms, by trees which he and his father had planted, overlooking the valley which they both had loved. The final words were spoken. In that peaceful place, a symbol of wisdom, truth, and great honor, now forever dwells. I find that stirring. His biographer was no slouch himself. Ambassador Philip Carroll Jessup, class of 1918, went on to serve as a judge in the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Had quite an influential career. He did live, was not born around here, but did live in Utica for a time. His son, a namesake, was born while he was living in Utica. Utica seemed to be a center for law. just a number of Hamilton alumni who became prominent lawyers or were prominent lawyers were in Utica for a time. In any event, Ambassador Jessup wrote the definitive two-volume biography of Elihu Root. So I always like to quote that. All right, if the cemetery is a place of tradition, it's also a place of irony, as we'll see, and oddities and controversies. And I think this is probably the greatest example of a rather strange controversy that went on, having to do with people who were buried in the cemetery. First of all, there are very few cemetery gravestones up there that have religious iconography on them. This one, of course, is the mother of all gravestones, religiously speaking. It's a Celtic cross, but very few other stones have religious symbolism on them. It is the grave of Paul Thatcher, who was professor of English at Hamilton College and also the director of the Hamilton Choir. He was married to Edith Thatcher, the daughter of a wealthy industrialist from New York City. And they lived very happily and well on College Hill in property adjoining the college property. They were also very serious Christians, very serious high church, we would say, high church Episcopalians. Another way we might think of them as Anglo-Catholics. And they decided that what they needed to have was for the community, was a Gothic chapel constructed on their property, but right next to Hamilton College property. And so Edith had the financial juice, so they hired Ralph Adams Cram, a well-known name in architectural circles. He's considered the foremost Gothic architect in the country, at least at that time. He designed much of the campus of Princeton University and the famous St. Thomas Fifth Avenue Church at 53rd Street and many other notable buildings. They hired him to design this chapel, and indeed plans were drawn. And old Elihu Root, remember he paid close attention to things going on here on the hill, rock-ribbed Protestant Presbyterian that he was, didn't like the idea of these Anglo-Catholic services being conducted on the hill. You know, smells, bells, vestments, the whole deal. And so he let it be known that this was going to be a problem. And there were some trustees at the time who were financially backing the project as well. They backed away, and so the Thatchers asked Cram to redesign the chapel as a Tudor cottage. And you see there at the left what was actually built and served the college very well for many years, called the Thatcher Guest House. Guests to the college would stay there. There are faculty members I know who, when they first moved to Clinton, would live there while they found their digs here in Clinton for a few months. So anyway, a beautiful little jewel of an example of the architecture of Ralph Adams Cram. The Thatchers continued, after they built it on their property, they continued to hold services, Anglo-Catholic services in the house, maybe somewhat surreptitiously, but Elihu Root, again, uncomfortable with this, had a fence. You can see, I call it the prophylactic fence. It was built around the house to shield the delicate religious sensibilities of the undergraduates from these, to Elihu's mind anyway, untoward religious practices. Sadly, the Thatcher Guest House was torn down in the year 2000 in the teeth of the architectural preservation community in Utica and the area, and I regret that today we don't have an example of Ralph Adams Cram architecture among our buildings on our campus. But the Science Center had to be expanded, and so tear it down they did. Incidentally, the person who was conducting those high Episcopalian services was a member of the class of 1909 at Hamilton, Frederick Hastings Smythe of the Clinton Smythe family. I was seeing, Dawn was showing me in the basement examples of the Smythe family owned the Clinton Metallic Paint Company. So that was where their wherewithal was from, and their offspring, Frederick Hastings Smythe, went on to become an Episcopal priest priest, and founded his own Anglican order of Episcopalians, and so he was involved in this. You know, I like to say, when you pluck a blade of grass out of Hamilton College Cemetery, you pull on a string that ties everybody and everything together, and that is never more true than in the case of the Fanchers. All right, I mentioned Alexander Wilcott, also class of 1909, the great class of 1909, by the way. There were a number of members of that class who went on to do notable things. Certainly, perhaps none more so than Alexander Wilcott, who dubbed the cemetery the Last Dormitory. He was kind of an odd undergraduate. He drank absinthe. He wore a Turkish fez. He didn't have a whole lot of friends as an undergraduate, but he left us and was an ardent supporter of Hamilton College. He was very fond of saying, whenever he could, I went to Hamilton College, and if you haven't heard of it, you can go to hell. His first job out of Hamilton was on the theater desk at the New York Times. He went on to be a noted and important literary critic of Broadway shows, plays, and so forth in New York City. He hosted a well-known national radio program entitled The Town Crier of the Air. There you see him at his microphone. One of the things he did, in addition to disparaging our friends at Colgate University down the road whenever he could, was to host the Hamilton College Choir on the national airwaves. And it was really that exposure that helped to cement Hamilton's reputation as a singing college. We were very proud of our vocal groups, our a cappella singers, and our college choir. And so the Fancher-Wilcott axis was very much in play there. In New York City, Wilcott was involved in founding the Algonquin Roundtable and the Algonquin Hotel on 44th Street in New York City, still there. That painting on this slide is also still there in the back room. You can go and sit underneath it and have a drink, a very expensive drink, I might add, but you can have a drink, and there's a picture of the Roundtable. You can see Alec Wilcott there with his glasses in the middle. It was also called the Vicious Circle. It was New York City's literati. Well-known writers would get together weekly in the 30s and early 40s to have wine-soaked luncheons where they would discuss literary affairs of the day and also viciously attack each other. Dorothy Parker, the noted writer, Dorothy Parker, was a regular and a friend of Alec Wilcott's, and used to say, Alec, you're not going, when you die, you're not going to heaven, you're going to Hamilton. And indeed, that was true. He very much wanted to be buried in the college cemetery. And when he died and his ashes were, when he was cremated and his ashes put in a box, they were sent to Hamilton, New York, where they languished in the custody of his despised Colgate University for a week or so, until someone on College Hill here had the sensible idea to pay the 67 cents postage due to facilitate the return of Wilcott's ashes to the college. We have the receipt in the archives. But that wasn't the end of it. Apparently when they placed the little container for the urn, you know, his urn was square and the container was round, or vice versa. In any event, it was a howling rainstorm on College Hill the day he was buried, and they had a hell of a time kind of actually getting him in the ground. And it was always thought that if he was up there looking down, he would have been amused by the ironic end to his life. I would also point out that you may have heard of the Broadway show and then movie, The Man Who Came to Dinner, that was based on the life of Alexander Wilcott. He was a man of parts, and people ask me who is the most famous Hamilton alumnus. I think hands down Elihu Root. By the way, I didn't mention in that drum roll of Elihu Root's accomplishments, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1912, the very year that he gave the lovely centennial address that I quoted from earlier. But so Elihu Root, most famous, I would argue Alexander Wilcott perhaps, the second most famous alumnus. Another important thing to note, if any of you are readers of the New Yorker magazine, that influential publication in this country, 3 Hamiltonians were involved in the origin story of the New Yorker magazine, and really were responsible for sustaining a very fragile magazine for the first 20 years of its existence as it gained esteem and financial and editorial strength. One was, of course, Alexander Wolcott himself, who was on the editorial board and contributed articles. The other 2 had interesting roles. The marvelously named Ravo Hawley Truax, of an ancient Hamilton family. His father, Chauncey Schaffer Truax, was class of 1875, a prominent New York City attorney and trustee of the college. R. Hawley, class of 1909, there's the class of 1909 again, worked his career with the New Yorker magazine. He was kind of the chief operating officer and responsible for the ongoing business affairs of the magazine. And then there was Lloyd Paul Stryker, class of 1906, who had his own day job as, at one time, America's foremost trial attorney, but on the side provided legal services to the New Yorker magazine. So the 3 of them, Wolcott, Truax, and Stryker, were essential to the founding editor of the magazine, Harold Ross, who's depicted on this magazine cover in silhouette. So that was a parody issue of the New York Times that they published in 1926, a year after the magazine had been published. And that is Harold Ross, the founding editor, looking through a monocle at an annoying insect, and that insect is Alexander Wolcott. Ross and Wolcott worked together, of course, on the magazine, but they were, it wasn't that they were enemies or rivals, they were just oil and water, personality-wise, and they were constantly at each other's throats. So Stryker and Truax, the main part of their job was keeping peace between Alexander Wolcott and Harold Ross. I have written an article for the Hamilton Alumni Magazine on this whole saga of the 3 Hamiltonians who were involved in the magazine. All right, you know, one thing I have learned about Hamilton over the years is that an awful lot of thought has been given to the placement of college buildings and their surrounding landscaping and so forth, and the cemetery is included in that. By the way, we are somewhat unusual having our own college cemetery. A lot of our peer institutions like Williams College and Amherst College and places like that, they buried their worthies in the town cemeteries, much as we did at Hamilton before the creation of the cemetery in 1820. Our earliest presidents and professors were buried in, I want to say, it must be the old burying ground, would that be the not Sunset, but the old burying ground, and then exhumed later and brought up to College Hill. So here a lovely view of College Hill, seeing our still existing prominent buildings, the chapel, South, Buttrick Hall, North Hall. If you're familiar with our campus, you know next to Buttrick Hall is the Kirkland Cottage, the small, humble white cottage that belonged to Samuel Kirkland. That, for a time, was at the entrance to the cemetery. You can see it right here. I'll show you a photograph in a minute of that. But there's our little cemetery. There's College Road, lined with Lombardy poplars, which sadly don't exist anymore today. But they were the gift. The scenes were the gift to Samuel Kirkland from Thomas Jefferson. Samuel Kirkland, knew George Washington, he knew Alexander Hamilton, he asked Alexander Hamilton to serve as a trustee of the Hamilton Oneida Academy, our forerunner institution, before we were chartered by the state of New York as Hamilton College in 1812. So the planting of those Lombardy poplars, which characterize all the old images of our campus, show those gorgeous looking trees. And that was Thomas Jefferson's fingerprints through Samuel Kirkland on our campus. You can also see there today's Anderson Alumni Center, which is the former Lee's Tavern, and then the Root Homestead. That is my office now, where my office is. And the series of yellow buildings, we call the Phillies Events Barn and the Beinecke Student Center, that was originally a salt barn. I was talking to someone just the other day who said, who was praising the water in Clinton, saying we have wonderful water here in Clinton. It's hard water, though, so we have to have a softener. Well, the reason Hamilton College had a gigantic salt barn on its campus was that they softened, I guess chemically, I'm not a chemist, but I guess you can soften water with salt. And Hamilton used to get its water from the reservoir, and they would use enormous quantities of salt to soften it for use on College Hill. So anyway, some landmarks there. And I point out Edward, we're going to talk about Edward North in a minute. His house was called Halfway Up because it was still there as you come up College Hill. By the way, College Hill itself was divided into 4 sections. One was called Freshman Hill, and you move up a little further and you got to Sophomore Hill, and you move up a little further, go around the bend, and it was Junior Hill, and finally when you reached the glorious top, that was called Senior Hill. So that's how the hill was known in those days. And Edward North's house, Italianate house, which is still there. Not sure who lives there. Maybe you know Sharon, but was called Halfway Up. Speaking of the intentionality of Hamilton College architecture, there's no secret to the fact that our first buildings were designed and planned to be reminiscent of Yale Row in New Haven, Connecticut. Well, there's a good reason for that, because 5 of our first 6 presidents were graduates of Yale College. So I think that's an interesting bit of parallelism. All right, into the cemetery itself. If you've been there, you're familiar perhaps with some of these monuments. I speak of ironies. Ironies abound in our cemetery. First of all, on the left to the, right there, the brown marble stone is our first president, Azel Backus. He was called Primus, Latin for first. Our president from 1812 to 1816. He was probably our most considerate and humble president. He was constantly bowing and scraping, and I beg your pardon, he would say, I beg your pardon. And that proved to be his undoing. One of his tutors contracted typhus, which was the pandemic of the day in the early 1800s. And Azel Backus, a Presbyterian minister, Yale graduate, nursed this tutor back to health, promptly caught typhus himself, and dropped dead after just 4 years of service as our president. He was our first and our fattest president, I think we can say. He had a special carriage, and in winter, a special sleigh designed with an extra wide opening to make it possible for him to get in and out. So Azel Backus, first and fattest. And by the way, that stone is the second Backus stone. He had a different one down in the village, and then was initially brought up to College Hill, but it had weathered and fallen apart, and so the second stone was purchased by our alumnus Garrett Smith, class of 1818, the noted abolitionist from over by where I live in Peterborough, New York, where his homestead is a museum. Garrett Smith married Azel Backus's daughter, Wealthea. Unfortunately, like her father, she was not long-lived. I think she only lived 6 months or so, maybe 9, into their marriage before she died. But the connection with the Backus family for Garrett Smith was still strong enough that around the year 1860, he purchased this glorious monument to honor our first president. Next to Backus on the left is the stone for a gorgeous example of Egyptian revival mortuary art. Again, no religious iconography, just a gorgeous piece of funerary art. Seth Norton, our first holder of a named chair in classical languages and literatures at Hamilton, he was the arch rival of Azel Backus. In fact, Azel used to say of Seth Norton is intriguing for my shoes. Intriguing for my shoes. Seth Norton had designs on high office. He wanted very badly to be president. And he got his 15 minutes of fame, and it really was about 15 minutes of fame, when Backus died of typhus Seth Norton was named acting president of Hamilton College for a time. So the irony here is that, of course, they are buried next to each other, which is nothing that either of them would have countenanced during their lives. Bless you. Bacchus's death opened the way for our second president, and you can see his stone in the middle there, that gray obelisk, Henry Davis. We'll talk about him a little bit more in a moment. There's ironies aplenty with Henry Davis. But there you have our first and second presidents. And I point out another irony is the perfectly, in my view, perfectly gorgeous stone for Carolyn Kaplan Munson. Carolyn Kaplan was the daughter of Marcus Kaplan, a member of the class of 1820 at Hamilton and a mathematics professor. She married Samuel P. Munson of the Utica Munsons. And when she died untimely, Samuel Munson made a large gift to Hamilton College to endow the cemetery, to provide a fund for perpetual care of his daughter's, his former wife's stone, and for the general upkeep of the cemetery. That is a beautiful example of Victorian mortuary art. On it, I think it has the loveliest inscription. Her memory is sweet. Her memory is sweet. I always like to think about that when I pass that stone. However, what's the irony? Well, you can see at the top of that stone, there's a little piece of metal sticking out. There was a stone cross that was affixed to the top, so it was a much taller monument in its original integrity. And that cross, that part was broken off and has never been found, never returned to the college. So the irony, of course, that the one stone that was indemnified against damage at the college is the only one in the cemetery to be damaged like that. So I don't know. I've thought a lot about that. I hope some knuckleheaded undergraduate, like the one we saw earlier in this show, didn't take it to his dorm room and it got lost or something. I've been hoping somebody would find it in the Root Glen or something, but no such luck yet. But here, if you look carefully over on the left, it's the only picture I have found in the archives where you can see, you see the little cross on the top. It's hard, sort of faded out, but there it is with the cross on top. It looks to be a beautiful thing. And what a great view of the cemetery. Looking up to there, you can see the Kirkland Cottage and the stone right in the center there of Samuel Kirkland himself and his great friend, Chief Shenandoah, Oskanadaha in the Oneida language, as I like to say. We'll talk more about them. Again, the topography or the horticulture of the cemetery looks much different than it did in 1895. Lots of changes in the intervening years. I promised you we'd come back to Henricus Davis Secundus, our second president, who came to us actually took office in 1817. Kind of interesting, he was a Yale graduate, was teaching at Middlebury College, and at the same time he was offered our presidency. He was offered the Middlebury College presidency, and he kind of played footsie with us a little bit. I think maybe holding out for a higher salary. Our trustees are nothing if not flinty, and so there was much debate over that. He didn't get more money, but at the end of the day, he did come to serve as our second president. Henry Davis. Well, if Bacchus was our first and fattest, Davis was our strongest and strangest president. Almost from the word go, he was reviled by the trustees and the faculty, and probably the students too. I'm pointing out there, he had a snuff habit. And he used to patrol the student residences at night to make sure that the students were at their academic labors. And they always knew he was coming and could stick their noses in books because he had a loud, trumpet-like sneeze because of his snuff habit. So they were always safe from any persecution from him. Really, his debate was with his beef, if I could put it that way, was with the board. And this was really the central issue of colleges like Hamilton in the 19th century. Who should control the college? Is it the board or is it the president? We now rightly think that the board hires the president and charges the president with conducting the affairs of the college with advice and consent from the board. But in those days, really all Hamilton trustees lived in the village. In fact, many of them up on College Hill. So they were constantly lurking around and sticking their noses into the business of the faculty and the president. And so there was immediate tension between the two. By 1828, the years 1828 to 1830, the college was on the rocks financially, in part because Henry Davis was a big spender. He had a vision for a growing college and was a builder of college buildings. South Hall went up under his watch. The chapel went up under Henry Davis's during his tenure. Kirkland Hall, what's now Kirkland Hall, used to be called Middle College, and North, what we call today North House, used to be Dexter. It was called Dexter in the day. Those were all projects of Henry Davis. So the college was overextended financially with these buildings, causing much anxiety among the trustees. To the right there is Samuel Eels, our wonderful alumnus, Samuel Eels, class of 1832. He was part of a group of students known as the Immortal Nine. In 1829, the college had whittled down to 9 students. The president, a chemistry professor, and 9 students. The Immortal Nine, of which Samuel Eels was one. I'd like to say, in all seriousness, that we have Hamilton College today is owing to the fortitude and the steel spine of Henry Davis, who somehow kept the college afloat, who kept the trustees at bay, won enough support from trustees to implement his plans and keep the college going when we damn near could have gone under. But he got his revenge, I guess you could say. He retired in 1832 and set about penning a tome, a treatise entitled The History of the Embarrassments and Decline of Hamilton College, in which he vented his spleen in dense black pages of type about all the things that the trustees had done wrong during his tenure as president. He also exercised his right as a former president to sit in the front row of the chapel and sneer at the trustees during their meetings and be critical of their decision making even after he was president. So he was a Puritan. He was a Puritan. He dressed in linsey woolsey suits, and he had silver buckles on his shoes. He brought New England ideals of higher education to Hamilton College, which is to say, almost draconian in the sense of discipline and so forth. So he was nobody's friend, but he kept us going. You can see visibly there on his stone pockmarks, and I don't know for certain, but I am guessing that those might be the result of buckshot or slingshots shot at his stone by his detractors after he died. I can only guess at that, but it makes sense given his difficult time on the Hill. I want to say a word about Samuel Eels. He was a sickly lad, the son of a missionary Protestant preacher from Westmoreland, down the road in Westmoreland, came to Hamilton College, and after a few months betook himself to New Haven, Connecticut on foot. He walked to New Haven, Connecticut on foot, where he put out to sea for a few months to regain his health, which he did, came back to Hamilton College, was a member he was part of the Immortal Nine, and in his senior year, in room number 15 of Kirkland Hall, today's Kirkland Hall, he founded the Alpha Delta Phi, the Alpha chapter of the Alpha Delta Phi fraternity at Hamilton. Why is that important? Well, we need to remember that in the 1800s, virtually almost all the way through the 19th century, faculty didn't really care about student social life. That was all, students were there to learn, and anything else was something they had to devise for themselves. So Hamilton had 2 literary societies. One was called the Phoenix, the other was the Philippian, the Phoenix and the Philippian Literary Society, and they had their value. They had well-stocked libraries that were open 24/7, basically. Believe it or not, well through the 19th century, the Hamilton College Library was open only a few hours a week. So the literary societies provided an academic service. They would debate each other raucously in the college chapel, and were generally considered socially divisive. socially divisive. Samuel Eales had a different idea on the idea of Greek. Hamilton wasn't the first ever to have a fraternity. There were, of course, other fraternities in other colleges, but the Alpha Delta Phi fraternity was his creation here at Hamilton, which then spread to other colleges. But the earliest ideals of the Greek system were noble, a healthy spirit, mind, and body. That was Samuel Eales' vision in founding the fraternities, and for decades, all of Hamilton's fraternities fulfilled that purpose for student life. All right. One of the things that we pride ourselves at Hamilton on is the individualized attention that we give to our students, and there's no better example of that, I think, than these two gentlemen, Joseph Bibbs Ibbotson, Joseph Darling Bibbs Ibbotson, class of 1890, professor of English, Hebrew, and Anglo-Saxon. How's that for a teaching load? And William Pierce Shepard, class of 1892, was a science student while he was an undergraduate, and after he graduated, he started teaching biology at Hamilton, and then decided to go abroad to Europe to get his doctorate in Romance languages, and returned to Hamilton, not as a biology professor, but as a professor of Romance languages. His specialty was medieval Provençal poetry. The two of these gentlemen were really intellectual lifelines for an odd loner student on College Hill named Ezra Pound. Class of 1905 would go on to worldwide fame for his really invention of modernism in English poetry. There you see on the right, the first page of his landmark publication called The Cantos. And as he said in some writings of his that we have at the college, the Cantos started in a talk with Bibb, that is to say, Joseph Ibbotson. So Shepard and Ibbotson were the intellectual crucible for young Ezra Pound, who really didn't, like Alexander Woollcott, was kind of an outcast. He was a loner. He didn't have much affection for the college. He called, if you can believe it, he called our beautiful College Hill a desolate mountaintop. And buzzards roost. That gives you an idea of his experience. So he had kind of a tough time as a student, but Ibbotson and Shepard influenced him, gave him support and inspiration. And so Hamilton College can rightly, I think, take credit for the pioneering achievement of Pound's cantos. Now, if you know anything about Ezra Pound, his life was not without controversy. He kind of fell in. He lived abroad in Europe, was in Italy, fell in with the fascists. I had an interview with Mussolini at one point, and at one point was broadcasting over the radio some speeches that were critical of the United States and our form of democracy. So he then was later judged to be insane and lived out his life in an asylum in Washington, D.C. That may have figured into it. So he's kind of in bad odor when we look back on him now, but no one can deny. And this is always the question: do you undervalue or toss away the art of someone who was problematic in some other ways? I mean, undeniably, his contribution to literature, I think, stands on its own, and Hamilton College's teaching tradition can take some credit for that. Every college like Hamilton has its collection of eccentric faculty members, and I'd just like to focus on one, probably the greatest eccentric in our faculty history, buried on College Hill. John Robert Mattingly, professor of classics, held a doctorate from the University of Chicago, was a spellbinding and engaging instructor, as he was known here, a friend, a colleague, and an epoch. The Mattingly years were an epoch in Hamilton history. But he was an eccentric, and I've given you some examples here. That horse, he rode a horse, and he owned a horse, as many Hamilton professors did, even into the 20th century, and he would tend it and groom it with a vacuum cleaner. He would vacuum his horse. That lovely-looking automobile up at the top there, well, he had a habit of, he bought his automobiles at the lowest price per pound. So he would go to the car dealer and ask how much it weighed and against the price, do the mathematics, and buy his car at the cheapest price per pound, and was known to be driving up and down College Hill in these cars of his with a German army helmet, because he was convinced that the United States was about to be overtaken by the Germans, well after World War II, by the way. So he was a classic eccentric on College Hill, but it was said by generations of Hamiltonians, never graduate without Mattingly. No matter what your major, never graduate without Mattingly. The original terms of the establishment of the cemetery in 1820 by the Board of Trustees included a clause for the students of the college. And I'm sad to say we have 12 students buried in our cemetery. None since 1964. We had 2 in the year 1964, Christopher Minor and Morefe Bele, a Nigerian student, an early international student at Hamilton. Although we have a member of the class of 1876 from Turkey who was buried on College Hill, much beloved among among the whole entire college community. They took an ad out in the Utica, the Utica Daily News, whatever the Utica paper was in the 1870s, as a subscription for his quite lovely monument, which is there. So we have 12 students, but fortunately none buried since 1964. The concept of janissary is something that's always interested me. A janissary is a devoted follower, and we've got 2, I think, classic examples of that buried together in our cemetery. There is, of course, the relationship between Samuel Kirkland, Domine Kirkland as he was known. Domine is a Scottish term of honor for teacher. Kirkland conceived and then founded the Hamilton Oneida Academy. Incidentally, you know, Hamilton College and Dartmouth College have identical origin stories. Kirkland was the protege of Eleazar Wheelock, the founder of Dartmouth, and both institutions had as their founding vision what we would call a multicultural vision for education. Both were founded to educate Native American children side by side with white colonial settlers children. Both failed miserably in their aims, but they were nobly intended. I would say in passing, an irony of Samuel Kirkland is that, of course, he came to the howling wilderness of the Mohawk Valley to missionize first the Seneca Indians and then the Oneidas, and ended his life a landed gentleman who built his fine house on Harding Road, Harding Farm, as it's called. That was Kirkland's house. Well, how did that happen? In this partnership between Chief Shenandoah and Kirkland resulted in Kirkland being very influential in keeping the Native American tribes on side with the American Revolution. And so out of gratitude for that role, that intermediary role that Kirkland had played as an influential missionary in New York State, George Washington granted him 3,000 acres of Native American, of Oneida land, on which the college sits today. And over the years, Kirkland sold off those parcels of that land and made a tidy sum for himself, such that, as I say, he ended his life not a penniless missionary, but as a landed gentleman whose son would go on to be president of Harvard College, John Kirkland. In any event, Chief Shenandoah was initially missionized by Samuel Kirkland, and then the 2 of them worked together, as I said, to keep the Oneida Indians on side with the American side of the Revolution. And Shenandoah, who lived, it's believed, to the age of 116, said that he wanted to be buried next to his great friend and mentor Samuel Kirkland. So that the great resurrection, I might cling to the hem of the garments of his clothes and be carried into heaven. And so they were initially buried down on Harding Farm, on Harding Road, and then in 1856 were exhumed and brought up next to each other on College Hill. Now, I like to say that I'd like to be reminded of Hamilton President Martin Caravano's brother was a lawyer, and he took kind of a dim view of the Hamilton College trustees and how slow-footed they were. And he used to say, if the world ever comes to an end, get yourself to Clinton, New York, because it will happen by motion of the Board of Trustees 2 weeks later. So that explains in part how we created the cemetery in 1820, and it took 36 more years for the trustees to get around to bringing our founder and his best friend up to College Hill. But there you have it. We've talked about Alexander Woolcott already. Right next to him is the stone for Frode Jensen. Frode Jensen, Hamilton College class of 1933. Frode was a Danish immigrant, an orphan who washed up on the shores of New York City and fell into the good graces of, I'm not sure who, but who funded his education. He was sent away to boarding school in Vermont, and from that boarding school was advised to attend Hamilton College. After Hamilton College, he undertook to become a doctor at Columbia Medical School, the College for Physicians and Surgeons in New York City. And it was in that capacity as a young orderly working his way through medical school in New York that he attended Alexander Woolcott. Woolcott had a lot of health problems toward the end of his life, so he was in and out of New York City hospitals. And on one occasion, actually it was somebody else at the hospital who said, I think you might want to meet this young orderly, Frode Jensen. He went to Hamilton College too. And so they made a connection, they became friends. Frode said to him, you know, I'm working 5 jobs to put myself through medical school, I'm going to quit. And Woolcott, who was a very generous man, had no family of his own, had a lot of money, and so offered to pay the medical school tuition for Frode Jensen, who continued his studies, graduated, became a Park Avenue physician in New York City, went on to become a trustee and donor of Hamilton College, just as Alexander Woolcott had been. They remained friendly throughout their life. I do believe Frode Jensen attended Alexander Woolcott when he died. Woolcott died of congestive heart failure. And so a beautiful story. So a janissary, someone who followed and lived a very good life in partnership with Alexander Woolcott. So we're proud to have those two next to each other. There's a lovely Jewish tradition that you might be familiar with, maybe not the term, but the practice. It's called the mitzvah of matzah. The mitzvah of matzah, and that is the placing of a pebble or a stone on top of a gravestone as a sign of respect. It says, I was here, I visited, I pay you honor and respect. And so you see at the left our noted dean and professor of economics, Sidney Werder. By the way, I wouldn't be surprised if one of those Hamilton College Fire Department helmets would belong to Sid. I've seen pictures of him wearing the Hamilton College Fire Department hat. Anyway, you can see there a stone placed in it. Very frequently, Werder's stone will have a mitzvah of matzah on it. John Anderson was a mathematics professor known for wearing, he had a club foot, and so found it more comfortable to wear Converse Chuck Taylor sneakers. That was his trademark, to pad with a suit. He'd pad about the math department with his Converse Chuck Taylors. So his students over the years have draped a pair of sneakers over the stone, and they get replaced when they disintegrate, like the ones you can see there. Don Potter was a geology professor, and appropriately, his matzah is a rusted geologist's hammer. And I saw a new one yesterday. Sadly, our wonderful professor was a friend of mine, Samuel Pellman, professor of music, who was tragically killed on his bicycle here in Clinton. He is buried in our cemetery, and he loved, during his lifetime, he had a collection of stuffed sheep. So everyone knew when you came back to visit Sam Pellman, you'd bring him a stuffed sheep, and his office was filled with them. And I noted just the other day when I was giving a tour of the cemetery that someone on his stone has placed a little sheep. And so I like to say it's the mitzvah of Matzvah with a Hamiltonian twist. And you can see how that has been carried out. All right. Edward North. I mentioned Edward North, owner and occupant of Halfway Up on College Hill Road. This man trod our shale pathways on College Hill for 60 years, if you can believe it. Starting in his student days, he was a member of the class of 1841 and spent the rest of his life teaching mostly Greek, a little Latin on the side, but mostly Greek, hence his nickname, Old Greek, Edward Old Greek North. And he bequeathed to the college four things really, I think, that are important to us today. First of all, he was a pack rat. He kept everything to do with the college that he could get his hands on, and it is owing to Edward North that we have the original sealed charter from 1812, chartering Hamilton College in the state of New York. That was found in a drawer that he had. Then there are three traditions that are very important to us at Hamilton that exist today. First of all, he was very friendly with all of his students and kept up voluminous correspondence with his former students after they left Hamilton. And that became what he called, in good classicist fashion, alumniana. We would say today class notes. But our class notes tradition today, which is highly prized by our alumni, came out of this tradition of writing letters back and forth between North and his many former students, including my own great-great-grandfather in the class of 1852. I have a letter that my great-great-grandfather wrote to Edward North. Second, at the other end of the spectrum, I suppose, is the necrology tradition. We promise all of our graduates a handcrafted memorial biography that gets published in our alumni magazine. And that tradition of writing a dignified memorial biography of every graduate was begun by Edward North and remains with us today. And then finally, he started the tradition of what we call the half-century analyst letter. And note the spelling of analyst. People confuse it. They think it's analyst as in analysis, but it's analyst in the sense of analyst, historian. Every year since 1865, almost without exception, I think maybe in a war year, in World War II, we might have missed a year or two, but every year since 1865, a member of the 50th reunion class has been selected to pen an address and deliver an address calling to mind the class's days on College Hill. Some of them, it's an invaluable historical resource for us because it describes, the first one was 1865, harking back to the class of 1815. That was given by George Bristol, one of the many important Bristols to Clinton and to Hamilton College. And so it's a historical archive for us. It's a great honor to be asked to prepare it and to deliver it. And in recent years, they've become highly entertaining. So it's a great way to spend our reunion weekend to listen to the class. And I'll say we gave no fewer than 4 of them. It was a bumper crop this year. We had 4 analyst letters delivered this year because we had, for the first time ever, a 50-year class from Kirkland College. So there was a Hamilton analyst letter, a Kirkland analyst letter, and then because of COVID, and we had missed 2 reunion years, the class of 70 and 1971 Hamilton College classes also gave their letters. So Edward North's spirit remains with us. Edward North said, I just get in the sense, there's a lot to the language of the dead, the speaking silence of the grave that Edward North wrote about. If we have ears to hear, and I hear it very clearly up there. All right, just to back up a little bit, I mentioned our cemetery was founded in 1820 by a motion of the Board of Trustees. I think that's remarkable that here we were 8 years after being chartered by the state of New York, that the trustees felt that this would be a college that would endure and that we would have indeed worthies and notables who would need to be buried on College Hill and their memories kept alive for us. I love the early language from that trustee motion. A suitable burying ground or a cemetery, misspelled, which I think is charming. And To this day, this is essentially what we honor for the interment of the officers of the college and their families, the students of the college, and my favorite clause, others attached thereto. That has been changed very little over the years. The trustees have tinkered with it a little bit. Today, the regulations are, and I have to say, your humble tour guide is not eligible to be buried in the Hamilton College Cemetery. It is essentially presidents, and there are 7 presidents buried already in our cemetery. One, Martin Caravano, just recently interred. It is a working cemetery, by the way. It is not a museum. We have sadly added half a dozen people, if not more, in the last 2 or 3 years. Presidents, faculty members, there are about 81 faculty who are buried. The trustees have tweaked that to say faculty of 7 years standing. You have to have worked at Hamilton for 7 years. We've also interpreted the officers of the college to include the vice presidents, the president and his senior staff, basically, and a few others who are in the higher ranks of administration, not me, and their families, but meaning spouses. The trustees have not wanted, since 1820, the trustees have not wanted our cemetery to become a family cemetery with generations of people buried there. So we've had to say no, unfortunately, to other family members of people who were buried there because of that feeling on the part of the board. There's another lovely picture from 1895. I love the old black and white pictures where you can see a very different looking cemetery, but the stones are the same. You can see Bacchus there, and Kirkland, and Davis, and so forth. By the way, our cemetery, I consider this vista from the cemetery. By the way, you used to be able to see all the way down into the valley before all the vegetation grew up. It was a commanding heights, commanding view of the valley. There was something current in the first half of the 19th century called the rural cemetery movement. And what was that? Well, it came largely from the pen of Andrew Jackson Downey. He wrote this Theory and Practice of Landscape Gardening, and contained in that treatise was the idea that cemeteries needed to evolve beyond what were churchyards and farm. And we see a lot of them around here, don't we? Those little hills with on area farms where there's 24 people buried, the people who worked the farm for 200 years or 300 years, whatever. But that what would have, we had the great westward migration in this country moving toward the west. And so what happened was these old churchyards, these old farm burying grounds were forgotten, and the stones collapsed and were covered over by vegetation. And the idea of the rural cemetery movement was that cemeteries should be places of happy resort. They should be rustic and rural. They should have weeping willows and hills and dales and perhaps even a babbling brook or two as places that would be preserved and where you would go not to mourn, but to celebrate the lives of dear old Ma and dear old Pa. You might even take a picnic lunch there. So beautiful would be the surroundings. And so our cemetery was designed, like the rest of the campus, very much with those landscape architectural ideas in mind. We don't have a babbling brook, unfortunately, or Wurlitzer organ, but it is still a lovely, lovely place. I mentioned oddities. We have ironies. We've heard plenty of those. We've heard about tradition, but we have oddities as well. And this one stands out for me as perhaps the oddest, next to the Fancher Anglo-Catholic situation. Next to that, Duncan Campbell Lee. Duncan Campbell Lee. By the way, I was putting in mind of him again. I was down in Ithaca, New York, and there's a book that's been published recently that tells this whole tale. I was pleased to see it. Duncan Campbell Lee was a member of the class of 1891 in Hamilton. He was a precocious student, particularly good at public speaking, of which we are very proud at Hamilton College. And in the early 1890s, Cornell University was looking to beef up its oratory department. And so where would Cornell look? Well, naturally, to that little Doughty College in the Mohawk Valley that produces fine speakers and has since 1812. And so Duncan Campbell Lee was selected as assistant professor of oratory at Cornell, and he began to teach. He also had a sideline in muckraking journalism, and he partnered up on the Ithaca Daily News with a young and recent Cornell graduate named Frank Gannett. Frank Gannett. And the two of them, Frank Gannett, of course, would go on to found the Gannett newspaper empire, originally headquartered in Rochester, New York. He and Gannett and Lee got onto a water pollution story. There was a typhoid epidemic in the environs of Ithaca, New York, and they traced it out to industrial discharge from a factory into the waterways around Ithaca, from a factory that was owned by a distinguished Cornell alumnus, trustee, and donor. They wrote a series of articles pointing the finger at this gentleman as the cause of the deaths, needless deaths of so many people owing to typhoid. Well, that was the end of the academic career at Cornell of Duncan Campbell Lee. He was not promoted to full professor, and he knew why. And so he betook himself to London, England, where he trained up as a lawyer, served notably at the Inns of Court in London, had a distinguished career, and said, "When I die, I wish my body to be buried in some shady place in England, but I would like my heart to be buried on College Hill." And so in August of 1945, and this is documented, I think of Mark Twain, I'm in some instances guilty with, Mark Twain used to say, the older I get, the more clearly I remember things that never happened. But this did happen. This is attested in the Hamilton Alumni magazine. In August of 1945, the widow of Duncan Campbell Lee came to College Hill with a box containing his heart and is buried under that stone, which is right next to Alexander Wilcott's stone, buried on College Hill. So that wish was fulfilled. I like to say, greater love hath no alumnus than to have his heart, or her heart, buried on College Hill. All right, these are our Flanders Fields. These are our Flanders Fields. You know that famous poem, "In Flanders Fields the poppies blow," World War I era poem. Anyway, these are our Flanders Fields. This is a map of the cemetery. We have sections named for the letters of the word Hamilton, as you can see, Hamilton. Anyway, there is, it's all been gridded out. There's plenty of room. And the pink plots are reservations. We have some 73 current reservations of trustees and faculty members who have reserved their spot in the cemetery. So as I said, we are a working cemetery. In fact, we just dedicated the stone of one of our esteemed trustees, Keith Wellen, just on Friday. So anyway, plenty of reservations and plenty of space for future interments. All right, and then back, just another glorious view from the early 1900s and reminding us of David Ellis's title for the tour. There were giants in the earth in those days from Genesis. There you can see, of course, you can see Kirkland, you can see Bacchus and Seth Norton and Henry Davis, so lovely view. We have a stereoscope picture of the cemetery. And I conclude my tours by quoting William Faulkner, who said, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." And I hope at the end of my tours people feel that, as I do, feel that very same way. And then I just love this quotation, Walt Whitman believed, I told you it's a literary experience as much as a historical one. Walt Whitman in his wonderful book, Leaves of Grass. What is grass but the beautiful uncut hair of graves? So I'll let you, as we come to an end, I'll let you reflect on that sentiment about hair and grass. That is my talk. I would welcome your questions, and I thank you for your interest in Hamilton College and its cemetery. Just about, I think I came in just about an hour, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Like clockwork, right in an hour. Any questions?
Get the lights.
About Hamilton, about the cemetery?
I have one.
Yes, Sharon.
You mentioned Thomas Jefferson and the poplars.
Yes.
What's the connection there?
Oh, just that Jefferson was, the Lombardy poplar is a European tree, and Jefferson, of course, was a frequent visitor to France in particular, and collected everything. collected everything, including seeds of plants of all kinds. And so he brought back laundry poplar seeds, and they found their way into Samuel Kirkland's hands, and he planted them on College Hill. I've learned this. I'm not a horticulturalist, and I had a vision. They were saying that they wanted to replace their cedars around the sort of wall of the cemetery now. Those aren't original. Originally, the cemetery was bounded by buckthorn, which sounds interesting, but apparently it's an invasive species. And so they got rid of the buckthorn, they planted the cedars, but they are deer magnets. So they're constantly being eaten by deer. And I didn't believe that until I was giving the tour on Thursday, and I was talking about Hazelbacchus, I think, and I looked over, and sure enough, there was a deer nibbled under a tree, nibbling at it. So there's a thought that perhaps they might replace those cedars. And I said, Lombardy poplars! And we got it, let's bring them back. And the horticulturists around told me that they're terrible trees. They disintegrate, I guess, after a time. They just sort of split in half and fall apart, and that's why they don't exist anymore on the hill. So I'm forgetting, there's one that looks sort of like it has a gorgeous shape, but it's much more hardy than a lottery poplar. But that's how and I think even the college's landscape architect has validated or verified that Sam Kirkland got the seeds from Thomas Jefferson. Other questions? Yes.
Did Leonidas come to see Shenandoah's grave?
Well, yes. I mean, good question. Yes, indeed. On 2 occasions, at least. So the Shenandoah stone that you saw on the slide is actually a relatively new stone that was placed in, I want to say, 2003, maybe, because his original stone that we saw in the old photographs had weathered terribly. So a new one was carved and placed in amid great pomp and ceremony, including a large representation of the United Nation was brought and blessed, and so that was one occasion. The second occasion, you may have heard that Joanne Shenandoah, the Grammy Award-winning musician, is buried in our cemetery. She is believed to be a distant descendant of Chief Shenandoah, hence the desire on the part of her husband, notably, and other members of her family to have her join Chief Shenandoah on College Hill. So she is there. It was a little bit contentious. Not everybody in the nation wanted her on College Hill, but she's there. There's a stone. There's not a plaque yet. I don't know if there will be a plaque, but there's a sort of rough carved stone that marks her grave. She's some distance from the chief because the area immediately around the Shenandoah stone is considered holy ground by the nation, and so there was not a question of Joanne being buried anywhere near that. So she's 100 yards away, or not 100 yards, 50 yards away, but she's there, and so there was certainly participation in her interment by the United